Hello and welcome to The Big Picture. The last week's majority decision of the British public to exit the European Union is slowly sinking in. As the enormity of the decision sinks in and the consequences of it is being understood, the United Kingdom is being thrown into disarray. A group has emerged on the social media demanding another vote. Another group wanting London to be kept apart, to be kept part of the European Union. Labour Party is in complete disarray. Even the Conservatives confused over who will replace Prime Minister David Cameron. Some are also suggesting that the referendum is not binding. Meanwhile, with Cameron announcing that the vote is binding, but is not going to trigger Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which will start the process of exiting European Union, and that it is up to the successor to do so, more confusion reigns. Meanwhile, many reports have appeared of attacks on migrants from both East European countries as well as Asians and especially of Islamic origin following the exit vote. So what are the lessons from Brexit for India and the rest of the world? We will discuss this today with Shankar Mukherjee, former ambassador and former High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Patrick French, British writer and historian, Prof. Arun Kumar of Centre for Economic Study and Planning at the JNU, Prof. Pushpesh Pant, political analyst, and Pramit Chaudhuri, consulting editor, Hindustan Times. Welcome to all of you. Patrick, do you sense a sense of regret among some of the voters, at least, who have voted leave?
I think there's a considerable volume of buyer's remorse from people who thought it might be a nice idea to reassert their control over their country and say, we want to get out of Europe. And then when the vote came in and they realized they'd won and they started to not only read the small print, but also actually look at the economic implications of what they'd done, as well as the changes that would be wrought on British law, which has European law incorporated into it as of the last 40 years and will need to be rewritten. I think many people then thought, well, I quite like the idea of a protest vote against the government, against David Cameron, against the European Union. But the consequences appear now to be a great deal more serious than they did when I went into the ballot box.
So does it mean, Patrick, that the people, the Remain people were unable to exactly express what the consequences of such a vote is to the people of Britain, and you know, it was their failure?
I think it's partly their failure. They were not good at putting out basic information about what the European Union did, about how tightly the United Kingdom is bound into the single market within Europe. And I think also to an extent the responsibility lies, if you switch it around and look at the other side, the people who were saying get out quite blatantly put out false information, claiming, for example, that Britain would immediately save £350 million per week, which it could spend on the National Health Service rather than giving it to the European Union, something which turned out to be untrue. I think that the Leave side also simply failed to put together a coherent plan of what it meant if they did leave. One of the really astonishing things, as somebody who's always believed to some extent in the idea of the solidity and the stability and the efficiency of the British state, is to find that here we are, 4 or 5 days after the election, and nobody seems to actually know what Brexit means. And when the leaders of the revolt, these people like 2 MPs, Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, when they are asked, what is your plan? What happens now? They say, oh, well, we don't have a plan. We thought maybe 10 Downing Street might have a contingency plan. We'll see what happens next.
Mr. Mukherjee, what happens next actually? You know, there's so much confusion now, even in what happens next?
Well, you know, Girish, I'm just a retired diplomat. The entire government of the United Kingdom, the ruling government and the opposition and the finest minds in Britain don't seem to know what happens next. So you'll forgive me if I, you know, sort of say that the future is absolutely uncertain. I agree completely with Patrick. Nobody thought through the consequences, and the reason are simple. This vote shows what a referendum can do if you offer a binary choice to an electorate, even an educated electorate with a long history of democracy, and push messages based on fear in the context of and messages which are which range from being slightly economical with the truth to plain lies. Apart from what Patrick mentioned, I mean, any number of misinformation was handed out, but the central message for the Leaves was immigration. Your jobs are going because of immigrants. We cannot progress because of immigrants. All our public institutions and services are under pressure because of immigrants. We must stop immigration. And who's stopping us? The European Union. We must get out so that we can, have much tougher border control. The rest was all detail. Today, a very senior Polish politician on BBC, Radek Sikorski, in fact, mentioned that your referendum was about the Poles, and I'm a Pole. And he even added that exactly what Patrick said. There is no plan. There's no plan from Boris Johnson in the Conservative Party or the other leaders. There is no plan from the Leaves, because the entire campaign from both sides was not based on handing across proper facts to the people of Britain. So what you have at the moment is basically a situation where somebody is, asleep, having a wonderful dream about waking up in the morning in a wonderful world, and suddenly find that the electricity has been cut off and there's no water in the taps, and no plans of how to restore them.
Yeah.
Finally, let's face one fundamental fact, which is already in the aftermath, just a few days after the referendum. Britain there has been no Brexit. Britain has not yet left the European Union. It has become an intense matter of debate between Britain and the EU about triggering Article 50, where Britain is saying they need time. Europe is impatient, although the most powerful politician in Germany, Angela Merkel, has said we agree that they do need a little time. But she added that there will be no informal consultations, no backroom talks.
Before that.
No informal, getting together and figuring out ways of getting ahead. And just finally, there's an irresistible force and an immovable object. The British people, no matter how bad the referendum was or whatever the flaws were, have voted to go. And the EU will not agree with the UK's #1 objective, which is access to the single market under the best of possible terms, or at least equal terms, unless they allow free movement of people, which is the fundamental pillar, one of the 4 pillars of the European project. Therefore, which of course the ones who voted Leaves cannot accept, because that was the basis of their campaign. So you have this, the uncertainty compounded because of all this.
Professor Arun Kumar, the economic consequences of it, people are only now realizing it, as Patrick was pointing out. How serious are they?
They're very serious. Let me say, uncertainty is one of the biggest problems that comes as far as financial markets are concerned, as far as investments are concerned, and that is where the real fear is. Let me also say the idea of a single market, which is an economic idea, was not so important for the British people when they were voting, because the political aspect of immigration, as has been pointed out by others, that became more important. And this goes back, in a sense, it's not as if it just happened. You go back to the crisis of 2007-8, and you go back to the fact that all these economies have been going through problems of improving their rates of growth, higher unemployment, stagnant wages of the middle classes and so on. The consumption of the middle classes declined in many cases because they lost employment. So there was a political crisis building. And this idea of the single market, which is a very important idea of the EU and of other, you have NAFTA in North America, you have, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, etc. The idea was that this will lead to more prosperity. But what has happened since 2007 is that a greater crisis has been taking place amongst the labor class, among the middle class, etc. And that's partly the reason why immigration became a very important thing. You also see large number of influx from Africa and West Asia into Europe, and the problem of these attacks that have taken place, which sort of played the background. So the question is that today, what will happen in economic terms? That is sinking in, because when you have uncertainty And the uncertainty, regarding investment, but also regarding who would remain in EU.
Exactly.
And if some of the countries are hoping, that they would also be able to do the referendum, and if they start leaving, then the EU as a program would collapse. If that happens, that is the uncertainty that will play itself out in the coming 2-3 years. And what is the kind of package that Britain gets will decide whether other countries will also split or not. So in other words, there's a hell of a lot of uncertainty in terms of the economics of it. And this could lead, because EU was the largest single economy in that sense, if you combine the EU, if that begins to go into recession as a result of all these things happening, the uncertainty and so on, that will definitely impact the US, which is their trading partner, which will impact China and India, etc. also. So we will also face that. Secondly, the investment that is coming into the Indian economy, that may actually start going back into US, etc. because the dollar is going to strengthen. With uncertainty, as you remember, 2007, the crisis began in the US, and yet it is the dollar which strengthened, because the dollar as a reserve currency was the most stable as the preferred currency, and that could happen once again, and therefore the stock markets in India, in China, other countries, they could decline as a result of the capital beginning to go out and go into safe haven, either gold or dollar or in the US economy. So India also has to face headwinds, which it has to now cater.
Okay. Professor Pant, is, referendums, that after this, you think every other country will have second thoughts on having some kind of on
I think, Girish, they should not only have second thoughts, they should have third thoughts, fourth thoughts, and banish the referendum forever. Now, I think what has come clearly is that it is always emotions trump reason. And even in, as you said in the prefatory remarks, in the most matured democracy in the world, the people could not take an informed decision. And I think, as Patrick rightly said, there were lots of blatant lies, but one expects that the British, with the maturity and their experience of democratic governance, should not be waiting for the government to give them media campaigns which are rational and give them information. Surely they have enough sources to, as citizen of most mature and oldest democracy in the world, to access information on their own. Britain is not a closed society. It's not as if that media hoodwink them. The second thing, which is, I agree entirely with what Patrick said and what Mr. Mukherjee said, the economic perils which Arun has said. But there is another thing. We can't get away from the fact there's a nation badly divided. You might say just 4 percentage points, but you are talking of a nation where, say, 51, 49, 48, 53% is there, and also there is a divide between the older Englishmen and the younger Englishmen.
Yes.
So you have
all kinds of divide.
And this is the kind of thing, and also people who are probably more pluralistic and people who are blatantly ultra-nationalistic and racist. So this is the kind of thing which you can't get away from. So you still have simmering discontent in Scotland, simmering discontent in Northern Ireland, some residual resentment in Wales, and
and in London.
And in London. So you possibly cannot have, is almost what you said, have the city of London as an island in itself. It would make Arvind Kejriwal very happy that have Delhi as a cosmopolitan international entity. Now, I think, we have to live with it. And one more thing I wanted to add. Some people in this country are very, very excited that now that new pastures will open up for India. India might even take on the leadership of Commonwealth and so on. I think Ashok did a very, very right way of mentioning that the note of caution has to be there. It might hurt us more than it might, that we are chasing mirages, that now we will have better options. European Union will look towards us. Americans would look towards us. I don't think I agree with all that at all. I think we are in for bad times. Uncertainty and turbulence is going to hit us all. And I think Patrick very rightly pointed out that Britain was the kind of a ballast on which India
emerged.
Premises too many things, like the rule of law, the supremacy of parliament. Now, when I teach law, I've been teaching the students that supremacy of parliament is a cardinal principle of English legal system. Here, the parliament wanted something else, and the direct democracy wanted something totally different. So ultimately, what happens to the supremacy of parliament? What happens to, as he rightly pointed out, Patrick, the 4 decades of the evolution where the British opted for a Supreme Court, the Privy Council and the House of Lords as a legal thing went away. You had the whole regime of human rights, and you have the international criminal courts and so on. And suddenly, you want to dismantle the system. So there are going to be implications of the English legal system in the common law countries where India is very much there.
Pramit, as far as the this whole thing is concerned, no, the referendum, of course, is something which would be discussed all over the world, whether referendums should take place at all, especially when there are elected governments in place, elected parliaments in place. So, what are the consequences of this globally?
The consequences of Brexit or the consequences of using referendums?
Brexit,
okay. Well, referendums are
Brexit leading to whatever.
Well, well, Brexit will now, at the heart of this is the question of the so-called European experiment, the creation of a European Union, which had a very radically different idea of how nations should operate. And in fact, the argument was that nations shouldn't operate. You should have a transnational entity. The European Union was designed to submerge sovereignty, that the concept of sovereignty would effectively be abolished. There would be total transparency between the systems. Your national security state would effectively be almost eradicated. The governments of Europe were designed to intervene in each other so that they would be comfortable with each other. That was the premise of it. Was a postmodern concept, if you wish, of how a nation state should operate. And the Europeans effectively argue that this would be the future. This is where the world would one day come and we would be the experiment, based on the fact that they had nearly destroyed themselves over a period of 2 or 3 centuries of warfare, that this would be the way we would handle. That experiment, of course, as has been mentioned, is now in doubt because the real concern now is France. Britain was not a member of the Eurozone, it's not a member of Schengen. Despite being the second largest economy in Europe, it was always somewhat on the margins of the core of the Euro. It was not a founding member of the European Union. It was just the largest of the marginal, slightly Eurosceptical nations that had joined the European later on. But the problem now is France. If you look at the polls, Euroscepticism, the approval rating of the EU in France today is higher than it was in England when England went to the Brexit vote. Second, you now have one candidate who has always argued, Marine Le Pen of the National Front, that she's argument has been that France should leave the Eurozone. Now she has said, I will also do a referendum in which France shall leave the European Union if I come to power as president. Presidential elections are next year. The French system has two rounds of voting, in which the first round you reduce all of the candidates to the top 2 candidates, and then you go for the last round. It is now almost certain that Le Pen will be one of the last 2 candidates in the final round. Her voting base is about 26 to 28% of the vote, and that's solid. The rest of the vote is divided by at least three real credible candidates. François Hollande, the president, and 2 right-wing candidates, Sarkozy and Alain Juppé. The problem now for France, and this is a crisis, when I was recently in Europe, the French establishment was extremely nervous because they said, if Hollande, who is a present incumbent president, goes against Le Pen, at present because Hollande is extremely unpopular, all of the polling evidence of the past 7 polls that have been taking place, 5 of them indicate Hollande would lose to Le Pen, and Le Pen would become the president of France. And she has said, my first act as president of France will be to say that France will leave the Eurozone.
And that has to be done through a referendum.
No, the Eurozone will be a presidential decree.
Okay.
The next step will be a referendum that we've now out of the Eurozone, let us leave the European Union altogether. At that point, when France leaves, the heart of the European Union was a Franco-German agreement to end the centuries of rivalry between them. She says there's no rivalry anymore, the European Union has no purpose. Once France leaves, the European Union is dead. The European experiment, as we call it today, is finished.
Patrick, these are all very, whatever is being said are quite, sounds quite ominous. But what do you think are the lessons from what has happened in Britain?
Well, the first and most obvious lesson is that a referendum is a very bad way to make a major decision on global policy, foreign policy for any government. I think it's maybe also worth saying that the idea of pooled sovereignty or shared sovereignty was never in practice how the European Union has worked. There may have been utopians who wanted it to become that, but certainly in practice it's never been like that. And I'd like to just briefly turn back away from the economics, away from Europe itself, to look at the United Kingdom, we have two things which are likely to happen now. One is that the Scottish government will again demand a referendum for Scottish independence, and if the current chaos continues, it's highly likely it will win. You also have Irish nationalists pointing out that the Good Friday Agreement, under which decades of terrorism between the IRA, the Irish rebel movement, if you like, against British control of Northern Ireland, came to give up their arms and have peace. That is now in jeopardy because of the demand for a vote over a united Ireland, to say that we in Ireland do not want to have a European border running down the middle of our country. So if those two things happen, both of them are reasonably likely, you will see the potential breakup of the United Kingdom after more than 300 years. It's that catastrophe that worries us perhaps even more than the immediate short-term economic risk.
Okay. Mr. Mukherjee? Mr. Mukherjee, what are the lessons for India?
Well, first of all, as Patrick and the others also pointed out, and I did too, if you want to take a very major policy decision in any sector, a referendum in which you offer a stark binary choice would seem to be the worst of all possible methods to do so. For instance, just to underline what I think everyone has been saying on this panel, suppose when the Scottish referendum on independence took place, which was for remaining in Great Britain by 55 to 45, suppose instead of the binary choice or within the binary choice, there was also a mention that about, that do we stay with Great Britain or do we go for independence? There was an explanatory line that said, please remember that 2 years down the line, there will be a vote under which Britain will leave the European Union. I'm sure even for that Scottish referendum, then Scotland would already be independent. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson, I think, is that whether it's a referendum or whether it's an election campaign, and we are extremely familiar with it, the first casualty is the truth. In fact, the lies are continuing. Boris Johnson has written an article saying that, please don't worry, we'll still have the single market, you'll still be able to travel freely in Europe, you'll still be able to buy a home in Europe and do business in Europe as before, which is all nonsense, because it all depends on how the negotiations go after Britain triggers Article 50 for leaving it. There was another, another huge campaign message that Europe on sovereignty, which somebody mentioned just now, that Europe controls 60% of our laws. Now, laws are made with the consent of all the member states, and there's a process, and it's finally endorsed by the European Parliament. Statistics show that in the last, I think, 9 or 10 years, Britain has voted for European Commission laws 95% of the time, voted against 2% of the time, and abstained 3% of the time. So the second message is that, again, in a referendum or even in an election campaign, the masses usually do not know the facts. The masses are usually fed misinformation, disinformation, and lies to buttress the arguments that one side or the other has to offer.
Okay.
I think that is the central message.
Okay.
The third is, I think, what Pushpesh mentioned, that when it's a fight between cold, hard logic, statistics, facts, figures, versus emotion, bigotry, hyped up fears, the latter mostly wins.
That's
I'm
the
not
unfortunate.
really a great fan of the wisdom of the masses.
That's the most unfortunate thing. So, Pant, lessons for India.
The major lesson, I think, Girish, is this, that we should not live under the illusion that this is going to open up options for us which are necessarily beneficial. We should not forget we have had a very close relationship with the British, not only the colonial rule, but after independence willfully opting for English system of education, English system of legal
part
system,
of the Commonwealth.
our constitution, we are part of Commonwealth. So we are going to be probably hurt more, and let's not get very excited about this, that because the pound is not doing well, the education for some Indian upper middle class or upper class students is going to be cheaper, buying an apartment in London is going to be cheaper. which I think is absolutely stupid.
And a holiday in London is going to get
So how many of us are having
education in America is now more expensive because the rupee fell against the dollar.
The moment your royalties of a writer like Patrick or me are converted from pound sterling to dollar and then converted into rupees into India, the royalties are going to be hurt. So let's not get into these stupid nonsense. In larger national interest, the economic hurt is going to be more than the economic gain.
Patrick, what are the lessons you think are for India?
Don't hold referendums.
Probably don't hold a referendum if one part of your country decides that it wants to do something that's going to cause damage to the rest of the country.
Professor Arun Kumar.
Yeah, I think we have to relook at what the markets do. Markets create divisions, it differentiates. And that's what the lesson is, that markets, as they've advanced since the mid-70s, they've created a differentiation, and inequalities have risen dramatically across all countries, whether it's US and so on. Krugman wrote an article in 2005.
But that point which
I'm coming to the point
Professor Pant made about, and this whole the analysis that India will benefit because of what has happened there.
So, but what I'm saying is that this idea that single market is beneficial to all and therefore politically is useful, that has been dented. Because there's a large differentiation that has grown, inequalities have increased, this thing about immigration and about the liberal ethos that used to prevail, that being dented. So what I'm arguing is that in India also we're talking around GST, that there'll be a single market, would be beneficial. We have to be very careful. If it creates differentiation between large scale and small scale, if it leads to unemployment, there'll be a huge problem. So this idea of single market needs to be revisited. I agree with what others have said that, is not going to be beneficial to India if the global economy goes down. But more than that, I think we have to think about our long-term policies.
The long-term policies within India or India's globally, the way India deals with other countries?
Globally as well as in India, that this idea that single market should not create differentiation of the kind that we've seen in the last 30, 40 years, that itself can then lead to political consequences, in spite of the fact that the single market idea may lead to higher economic growth, may lead to various other positive things, but politically it could be damaging, socially it could be damaging. And that's what we are seeing playing out in Europe. That's what we see playing out, in the phenomenon of Trump rising in the USA. That's what we see happening in the UK. So I think we have to be very careful and interpret this Brexit as a long-term phenomena, which we need to be careful about.
Pramit?
Well,
as far as India is concerned, and also
I'd have
globally.
to disagree. I actually don't think the European Union had very much to do with inequality in Europe. The destruction of the manufacturing base of England actually goes back to the 1970s, well before Britain actually integrates with the European Union. But anyway, the real issue for me is that when I look at it, why did the referendum happen? Why did Brexit occur? It was because David Cameron, the Prime Minister, decided that this was the way to solve an internal party division.
Exactly.
He was attempting to stop what was effectively in 2011 the worst rebellion within the Conservative Party, when 84 MPs voted against him on this issue. And he decided to therefore externalize what was essentially an intra-party conflict into the national political system by saying that if I just do this referendum, I solve my intra-party conflict once and for all. That was an extraordinarily dangerous decision. And this is actually the lesson, in my view, that any Indian leader or any Indian political leader should, that there are certain issues at the national level, whether on foreign policy, economics, or security, that you have to be very careful, that have to be, if you wish, firewalled away from your domestic political, and particularly in this case, simply an intra-political, intra-party division, where he then tries to externalize it, exploit. I mean, clearly Cameron, and even I would argue Boris Johnson, assumed that the Leave would not win. They just assumed sitting in London, oh, this is not going to possibly happen. So I'll use this to solve a small, what is essentially an intra-party problem, and it proved to be a disaster.
Okay.
And that's what the lesson, I think, Indian political leaders have to look at.
I think you've made a very interesting point. Intra-party problems, don't try to blow it out into a national problem. That's a very major lesson which everybody, everywhere should learn. Thanks to all my guests. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue, Big Picture, same time tomorrow.